The Moura 4 explosion. A mine explosion requires fuel, oxygen, and a source of ignition. The inquiry found that the most likely source of the fuel for the explosion was methane and coal dust from the GOEF, which was ignited and then further developed into a coal dust explosion, propagating out by. There are 4 general categories of sources of ignition, which include prohibited articles, mining sources of ignition, mechanical sources of ignition, and electrical source of ignition. The inquiry found that there were a range of possible sources of ignition for the explosion. Officially, the most likely source was the deputy's flame safety lamp, but it considered other potential sources of ignition, which could not be completely eliminated. Considering the anticipated major roof fall, the inquiry found that the wind blast from the fall blew a mixture of methane, air, and coal dust into the working areas. An explosive mixture of gas and dust developed, which then encountered a source of ignition. An initial explosion occurred, which then raised a dust cloud, and a much more violent coal dust explosion propagated out by. Sources of ignition in coal mine explosions can be broken down into 3 categories: obvious sources of ignition, determined sources of ignition, uncertain sources of ignition. In some mine explosions, the source of ignition is obvious, such as Box Flat, Kayanga, and North Goonyella, when the mine is already on fire. Then there's an explosion. It's almost anticipated. In other mine explosions, such as Upper Big Branch and Sago in the USA, and Moura 2 in 1994, the source of ignition becomes apparent during the investigation into the explosion. It may not have been obvious at the time of the explosion, but it's reasonably easy to determine through a thorough investigation. Explosions such as Moura 4, Pike River, Blakefield South, and now Grosvenor, the actual source of ignition is not apparent and the investigation is not conclusive as to the actual source of ignition. Moura 4 is in this category of an uncertain source of ignition. At Moura 4, there were 2 almost simultaneous explosions. The initial methane explosion, which acts as a detonator for the more violent coal dust explosion. There is minor damage in the in-by areas of the main dips panel from the methane explosion. There is further complete devastation out by along the belt road and the travel road from the force of the coal dust explosion. Observe the mine plan along the belt road. Note the increasing damage to the conveyor belt between 24 and 23 cut-throughs until the explosion is quenched by the swilly between 23 and 22 cut-through. Only luck prevented the explosion from propagating further out of the mine. The inquiry discounted any evidence of fire or spontaneous combustion, electrical apparatus, cables, static electricity, mechanical equipment, including the conveyor belt, the aluminium Entonox cylinder, and contraband. The inquiry considered frictional ignition of rock-on-rock unlikely, as it was not able to ignite methane in the tests conducted until the rock almost reached melting point. The inquiry concluded that a frictional ignition from the sandstone on sandstone of the type found at Moura is highly unlikely to have been the source of ignition. The members of the inquiry formed the view that the most likely source of ignition was the flame safety lamp. Further details about the flame safety lamp are included in the flame safety lamp presentation. Subsequent reviews by other explosion experts questioned the source of ignition and the origins of the explosion based on blast patterns and the injury suffered by the miners in the panel. No report has been able to identify the source of ignition with any certainty, such is the nature of an underground coal mine explosion. Any source of ignition in an underground coal mine is an unacceptable risk. In your work group, identify the potential source of ignition at your mine and how you are going to eliminate them.